if you want to be rich and prosperous, if you want to do business in the Indian Ocean world, you can't be going and scaring your neighbors and doing these kinds of things.
ये थोड़ा ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी जैसा नहीं लग रहा कि मतलब उन्होंने जो किया वो अलग बात है, लेकिन
हाँ.
जो अरेंजमेंट है स्टेट और मर्चेंट्स का जो रिश्ता है वो कुछ वैसा ही नहीं लग रहा आपको भी?
हाँ, लग रहा है, पर the Cholas did it first. So we are able to understand the voice of the powerful. We are able to actually peer more deeply into the societies that they were a part of. And to me, I think that is the most important part of studying history in a democracy. It is for us to understand how power operates. How did power operate then? How does power operate now? You'll see that very often it's quite similar in a lot of ways that you don't expect.
स्वस्ति श्री सौरभ, कैसे हैं आप?
अरे क्या बात है। क्या जय जय समृद्धि। हाँ,
हाँ।
बहुत बहुत बढ़िया। तो प्रणय, क्या हाल है? ख्याति, क्या हाल चाल?
हाँ, बस हाल-चाल एकदम बढ़िया है। जैसे आप लोगों ने बताया, हम पिछले हफ्ते जब हम बातें कर रहे थे ध्रुवा जयशंकर के साथ, तो हमारी बातों में एक बात ये आई थी कि इतने सारे सेंचुरीज़ में भारत में अगर कोई एक डायनेस्टी रही है, जिसने भारत से बाहर जाके भी चढ़ाई करने की सक्सेसफुल चढ़ाई की हुई है, तो वो शायद एक ही डायनेस्टी है, वो है चोला राजवंश, जिसका नाम आता रहता है। पर ये बात है कि हम सबका ज्ञान चोला डायनेस्टी के बारे में वहीं से शुरू होता है और वहीं खत्म हो जाता है काफी बार। तो क्यों ना आज थोड़ा चोलास कौन थे और इस राजवंश के लोग किस तरह से बढ़े, उन्होंने क्या क्या किया, इस पे थोड़ा और पुलियाबाजी की जाए।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। हाँ, और इसके ऊपर तो एक शानदार किताब आई है जो हमारे दोस्त अनिरुद्ध कनिसेट्टी ने लिखी है। तो अनिरुद्ध जुड़ रहे हैं हमारे साथ पुलियाबाजी में। वेलकम अनिरुद्ध टू पुलियाबाजी।
Namaste, namaste, Pranay ji, Saurabh ji, Khyati ji. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
वैसे ये भी हो गया, सब जीसीपीपीएन्स आ गए वापस, तो चारों जीसीपीपी वाले हैं और तक्षशिला से भी जुड़े हैं, तो वो भी स्पेशल है पुलियाबाजी के लिए। और वैसे ये किताब लॉर्ड्स ऑफ अर्थ एंड सी अनिरुद्ध की दूसरी किताब है। पहली किताब भी काफी प्रचलित हुई, लॉर्ड्स ऑफ द डेक्कन। और अनिरुद्ध, हम लोग एक अक्सर सोचते हैं कि जैसे हम लोग जब इतिहास पढ़ते हैं तो हम लोग को गुप्तास पीरियड याद आता है, उसके बाद एक अंधेरा रहता है और सीधा दिल्ली सल्तनत आ जाता है। उसके बीच में इतना बड़ा राजवंश था, चोलास, और कितना कुछ किया था, उसके बारे में अक्सर हमें कम ज्ञान रहता है। तो बहुत ही शानदार है कि आपने इसके ऊपर एक जबरदस्त किताब लिखी है। किताब में इतने रेफरेंसेस है, इतने शानदार चित्र हैं, तो लोगों को एक नई रिडिस्कवरी होगी, इसकी आशा है, और लोग और कुछ बहुत कुछ पढ़ेंगे। तो शुरुआत वहीं से करते हैं जहां ख्याति ने बात की थी। तो सबसे पहले चोलास की डोमेस्टिक पॉलिसी जाने से पहले सीधा फॉरेन पॉलिसी से स्टार्ट करते हैं कि ये जो हम लोग बात करते हैं एक्सपीडिशन था चोलास का साउथ ईस्ट एशिया में, तो ये कैसे था वहां पे, कैसे वहां तक वो पहुंच गए, क्यों पहुंच गए, इसके बारे में बताइए हमें।
So when I started researching this book, मैं सोच रहा था कि there must be a Chola navy. There must be evidence of how they sent this naval force overseas. Because how did they convey their troops over there? The navy is the most obvious answer. Today we think that India's great aspiration is to be able to project naval power to that part of Southeast Asia. But the surprising thing is, अगर हम Cholas के primary sources देखते हैं, if you look at the inscriptions that they made on temples, you'll see a lot of mentions of the army. They'll talk about, oh, with this army we conquered such and such territory. You will see army ke individual units making gifts to the temples. You will see senapatis, army generals, making a lot of temple gifts, bronzes, jewelry, etc., etc. But to my great surprise, there's no mention of naval officers. There's no mention of naval units, which is surprising because the
Yeah.
Torahs love documenting things. Their temples are not only temples but also like archives of who are the people giving gifts. So if they had a great navy, then you would expect to see that evidence on the temple walls. But strangely, that is not there. There are so many sculptures of warriors with swords, with shields, no depictions of ships in the Chola sculptures, which is, I think, very significant. So in this process, I was thinking and thinking, and then gradually I realized that the answer has been staring us in the face all along. अगर हम इंडियन ओशन के इतिहास देखते हैं, then by and large, the people who are most interested in the seeds are always the merchants. This was also, it was the case for the British, it was the case for the Portuguese, it was the case for the Arabs, for the Chinese, and it was absolutely the case for the Tamils as well. So, from very early in history, we have evidence of Tamils who are not living in India, who are living on the various parts of Southeast Asia. We know that from the 8th century, they were living in Thailand. There have been ruins found of a Vishnu temple, for example. And for the many, many centuries after that, right up till very recently, even today, if you go to Burma, you will see there is a large Tamil diaspora that is still living there. Even after the partition of Burma from the British Raj, there are a lot of Tamils across Southeast Asia. So gradually, I began to realize that maybe that is the real story. What were the Tamil merchants doing? Why was it that the how was it that the Cholas reached this other shore? We know that there's no mention in the Chola inscriptions of boats, but there's mentions in the the Tamil merchant inscriptions of boats, of taxes that were raised by the merchants on boats. We have a lot of mentions in the merchant inscriptions talking about how the merchants are great warriors. Their bodies are covered in scars. We have mentions of them having like private bodyguard units, all of those things. So I think that the answer has been staring us in the face all along. We have been looking in the wrong direction. We have been thinking that the Chola state must have been the same as the 21st century Indian state. But why? It's been 1,000 years. Obviously, the nature of the state, how the state organizes, how the state projects power, all of these things change. I think what we are seeing 1,000 years back is this unprecedented alliance of state and merchant, and that's what made the Cholas really unique, is that no other Indian dynasty has that clear and persistent ability to see merchant interests as the dynasty's interests. If you look at the Chola embassies to China, they send ambassadors who are merchants. And it's very interesting because if you look at the Chinese court records, they will say that, okay, on the behalf of the Chola king, the ambassador gave such and such amount of pearls. And then they'll say, on his own behalf, the ambassador gave such and such amount of pearls. Why is the ambassador also giving gifts to the court? Because he is a merchant. He also wants the tax concessions. So there's this very unique thing happening where a merchant can be a warrior can be a courtier can be a merchant. And that's what I think one of the many, many reasons why the Cholas are really very unique.
तो ये थोड़ा स्टार वॉर्स टाइप है जहां पे वो अलग जो ट्रेडिंग गिल्ड्स होती हैं वो एम्पायर के साथ में अलायंस करती हैं, उसकी सिर्फ उसके अंदर की यूनिट नहीं होती है ना. स्टार वॉर्स की जो दुनिया है वो कुछ इसी तरीके की है. तो चोलास जो है, तो ये मणिरत्नम ने पोनियन सेल्वन में मिस कर दिया इस टाइप का, क्या कहते हैं, यूनिवर्स बिल्डिंग. हाँ,
yes.
हाँ.
अरे पर अनिरुद्ध, जब आप ये कह रहे थे कि ये इतना अनप्रेसिडेंटेड और यूनिक, मुझे इसलिए नहीं लग रहा था क्योंकि ये थोड़ा ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी जैसा नहीं लग रहा कि वहां पर भी मतलब उन्होंने जो किया वो अलग बात है, लेकिन
हाँ.
जो अरेंजमेंट है स्टेट और मर्चेंट्स का जो रिश्ता है वो कुछ ऐसा वैसा ही नहीं लग रहा आपको भी?
हाँ, लग रहा है, पर the Cholas did it first, so we are the precedent for the East India companies.
एग्जैक्टली हाँ, वही तो. अब हम लोग जब ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को इस तरीके से देखते हैं तो अब लगता है कि एक्चुअली ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी ऐसे कर रहा था तो उसके भी पहले कोई शायद कर ही रहा होगा. और शायद दिस वाज व्हाट वाज
This is, and
पर
there is
मुझे एक
so much
सवाल
evidence.
है.
Yes, please, Khyati, yes.
हाँ, सो मुझे एक सवाल है कि अगर ये मर्चेंट जो थे वो लोग को बहुत समय से ये ट्रेड कर रहे होंगे ना, और वो ट्रेड एक विश्वास के ऊपर चलता होगा कि
हाँ.
ठीक है हमारे शिप्स यहाँ आएंगे तो मतलब सेफ है, तभी तो वो आने देंगे, राइट? तो जब वो उन्होंने ये डिसीजन लिया इस तरह से कि एक्सपीडिशन वहाँ जाके श्री विजया किंगडम पे चढ़ाई करने का, तो ये कैलकुलेशन तो कुछ रही होगी इसके आसपास कि अगर हम चढ़ाई कर देंगे तो फिर क्या होगा, उसके बाद के कंसिक्वेंसेस क्या होंगे. तो ये सब की जो कहानी है क्या है वो थोड़ा बताइए हमारे लिए.
That's a fantastic question. See, we always ask this, we always think, why was it only the Cholas who did this? And we think that it is because of the dynasty. To an extent, I think, yes, they're the only dynasty who had that imagination. But more importantly, it is because the merchants understood that if you want to do business, you can't be going and creating too much trouble like this, because then people won't trust you. So then you have to ask, what was this exceptional circumstance that convinced the Tamil merchants that some armed intervention is required? And there are hints of this. If you look at, once again, if you look at the Chinese court chronicles, you find out there was something called Sri Vijaya. So once again, this is a very different kind of empire. It is like a confederation of ports. And these guys were telling the Chinese that the Cholas are our vassals to get
Mm.
good trade concessions from the Chinese. And you can imagine that the not only did the Cholas not like this, more importantly, the Tamil merchants did not like this.
Mm.
क्योंकि we have to look not just at the geopolitical situation, we also have to understand the commercial situation क्या था. Or if you look at the inscriptions of the early 11th century, you'll see that the Cholas are trying to build very big temples. And they in their temples they want to gift to the gods the most fine and rare products from across the world. Now, all of us burn a particular aromatic in our home altars, camphor, which today is the easiest thing to get. No? You just go walk down to the shop, you can get any amount of camphor. It's not even that expensive. But this was not the case 1000 years ago. Camphor is not a Indian tree. Camphor is a Indonesian tree. It grows in Sumatra.
Mm.
So I think that what is happening is that there was a growing demand within Tamil Nadu and also more broadly in various Indian Ocean courts. Camphor ka demand tha, पर Srivijaya had a complete control of the camphor trade, and the Tamil merchants wanted a part of that. They wanted to be able to trade onwards to China, and so I'm sure there must have been some diplomatic attempts. If you look at the Chola inscriptions, you'll see there are embassies happening between Srivijaya and the Chola kingdom. They're coming, they're making gifts, in Chola temples, they're building Buddhist monasteries. All these things are happening. But I think that the diplomacy failed. I think that it did not work out. And that's how this exceptional set of circumstances came together. The merchants were fed up, they had the logistical capability. The Chola king was insulted. He had the incentive to expand and to obtain wealth from overseas. And so the both sides came together and decided to teach Srivijaya a lesson. But that's the interesting thing. Once they go and teach them that lesson, फिर से they don't go back again. You have no other evidence of the Cholas going and attacking Southeast Asia. And I think they also understood ki, if you want to be rich and prosperous, if you want to do business in the Indian Ocean world, you can't be going and scaring your neighbors and doing these kinds of things. There is a way to do business. There is a reason why it's only many, many centuries later, 500 years later, that foreigners, Europeans, the Portuguese, who have no idea of the niceties and norms of the Indian Ocean, come and start doing this bombarding and like setting up of these port cities and factories and that sort of thing. So it was generally not done in the Indian Ocean world. There were some exceptional reasons why the
और
Cholas.
ये श्री विजया जस्ट हमारे रेफरेंस के लिए रफली इंडोनेशिया लोग बोलते हैं, लेकिन यू आर सेइंग कि वहां के कुछ पोर्ट्स, पूरा इंडोनेशिया तो बहुत बड़ा है आज की
हाँ
डेट में,
तो
पर वहां के
सुमात्रा
कुछ
और मलेशिया के एरिया में,
के
सो
एरिया
द
में,
एरिया अराउंड प्रेजेंट डे केडा, Palembang, all of these were small ports within the overall Srivijaya alliance.
राइट. और ये मर्चेंट लोगों का नाम भी जबरदस्त है, 500 ऐसे, मतलब ऐसे
Yes.
खतरनाक टाइप का है.
The Ainur, the 500 and the 1000 directions known in all the 18 lands. That's what they call themselves.
हाँ हाँ, जबरदस्त.
ये तो इसके ऊपर वापस आएंगे क्योंकि ये बहुत दिलचस्प बात है और हम लोग फॉरेन पॉलिसी पर ही एक पूरी पुलियाबाजी कर सकते हैं. लेकिन पहले थोड़ा रिवाइंड करते हैं और अब शुरुआत से शुरू करते हैं कि ये चोलास कौन थे, कहाँ से आए, वगैरह वगैरह. लेकिन उससे पहले एक और सवाल अनिरुद्ध कि हम लोग जब ये पढ़ते हैं या आपने जब ये किताब लिखी तो इसके स्रोत क्या थे, सोर्सेस क्या थे उस टाइम की, क्या किताबें हैं अभी तक कुछ मौजूद, या फिर जो अभिलेख इंस्क्रिप्शंस तो हैं जो काफी आपने बताया, लेकिन क्या क्या चीजें हैं उस टाइम की जो हमें अभी अवेलेबल है ये लिख पाने के लिए, वो बताइए ना, वो बहुत दिलचस्प लगता है मुझे.
So the main source that we have are the gifts that are given to temples. But there's something very special about Tamil temples. Now, Pranay ji, have you ever gone to the Bhoganandishwara temple at Nandi Hills where we do our workshops?
सिर्फ 25 बार गया हूं.
Yes. So tell me, when you look at the walls of the Bhoganandishwara temple, do you ever see any completely flat surface? No, it's always the Deccan style of temple architecture is that there's always these ins and outs, these recesses and projections. There's a sense of rhythm in the temple. But if you were to look at a Tamil temple, they always have these completely flat walls. And this is not just for decoration. The flat walls are used as a base for writing inscriptions. So whenever a temple is set up in the Deccan or in North India, there'll be a foundation inscription saying that such and such king, such and such merchant has set up this temple. But whatever new additions are made to the temple, those records would have been kept on palm leaf. And palm leaf, unfortunately, does not survive very long in the Indian climate. You have to keep on copying it out again and again, and nobody has time to do all of that. But the amazing thing about the Tamil temple is that whenever a new, not only when the temple is founded, but when gifts are made to the temple, they would keep a soft copy on paper or on palm leaf, but they would also have a hard copy on the temple walls. And we know that in some cases, when there was not a correct match between the palm leaf and the stone was considered to be the definitive proof. So that was a permanent record. So we have a possibility when you look at a Tamil temple, year by year, you can tell who is giving gifts. And very interestingly, you will see at the beginning of the Chola period, the gifts are mostly being given by a wide cross section of society. You see, for example, shepherds giving gifts. You see washer people giving gifts. And of course, you see royals also giving gifts. In the 11th century, when the Cholas are emerging as the dominant superpower, it is mostly royals, army officers who are giving gifts. Then in the 12th and 13th centuries, when their dynasty is declining, it is once again a diverse section of wealthy people. So, landlords, Brahmins, bureaucrats, merchants who are giving the gift. So, simply by looking at the inscriptions, who is giving the gift, you are able to understand that the society is changing. But when you look with a more fine grained analysis, you can trace out individual people. If you put together a whole bunch of temples, different temples, you can say, oh, Queen Sembian Mahadevi was at this temple in this year, she was in that temple in that year. In this temple, she's saying this, but in that temple, she's saying that. Why is this? It's because medieval rulers, like today's rulers, were politicians. They are capable of being many different things to many different people, telling different stories to different people, depending on who the audience is. So that is another way to understand who are the people of these times. But to me, I think a very especially powerful way of understanding the past, and what I really enjoy doing in the book, is looking at the architecture. When you look at very small details, normally when any of us look at temples, we're just like, oh, temple, beautiful, very nice. But if you look at what does the basement of the temple look like, are there lotus petals, are there carved lions? And then when you look at the inscriptions, you'll see, okay, so this particular family, whenever they build a temple, always use this particular style. So when somebody from a different family is using that style, then you can understand that ideas have been exchanged. So visually also you begin to get a lot of valuable information. And finally, of course there is a lot. There's some literature surviving, various Chola period court sources and religious literature outside the court. But the most interesting source that is still being discovered are archaeological evidence. So, as part of the research for the book, I talked to archaeologists who excavated Anuradhapura, which used to be the capital of Sri Lanka, which the Cholas conquered. I looked at archaeological excavations of Tamil merchant settlements in Sumatra to understand how they were getting their hands on camphor. How did these communities structure themselves? So, there is, compared to most medieval dynasties, especially for the Cholas, we have a lot of material. So, it's capable to write a very rich and detailed history, seeing how South India changed over 300 years.
और
और
ये
ये रफली 300 years है 900 से 1200 तक.
That is yeah. So the dynasty is founded in 850, but for the first 50 years they are not even fully independent. They're usually trying to balance off the other powers in the region. It's really from from Noso, the year 907 or so, that they are really on the ascendant and they're becoming like a powerful and independent kingdom.
तो अनिरुद्ध थोड़ा-सा ये बताइए ना कि चोलास जब उभर के आए बड़े राजा बनकर, तब उनके आसपास और कौन-सी डायनेस्टीज़ थी, उनके साथ उनको लड़ना पड़ा और वो किस तरह से वो इतने बड़े राजा बन के उभर के आए?
So, so when they're beginning, today, if you look at the Kaveri floodplain area, it is one of the most urbanized parts, not just of Tamil Nadu, but really in all of South India. It's a very, very urban region. But 1000 years ago, when the Cholas were just starting out, it was actually a little bit of a backwater. If any of you have, if we must have heard of the Pallava dynasty that built Mahabalipuram. So the Pallavas were a very powerful kingdom in the northern part of Tamil Nadu. In the southern part of Tamil Nadu, you had the Pandyas around Madurai, who are also very powerful. Now, for both of these kingdoms, the Kaveri is the backwater, it is the frontier region. So, there are many different small players in the Kaveri. There is not one single great ruler. And the interesting thing about these players is that they are not all kings. Many of them are simply village assemblies. Some villages will coordinate with other villages to form a very small territorial unit called a Nadu. And the Nadu takes all the decisions about irrigation, about taxation, about justice, when to hold the annual market. All these decisions are taken by the Nadu assembly. In the Nadus, most of the land is owned collectively. Private property, today we take it for granted, but 1000 years ago it was not so widespread. So there were very few families who owned significant amounts of land. These landowning families became the nuclei of royal dynasties. Among these many landowning families, one of them called themselves the Cholas. Now, the name Chola is actually a very ancient one. It dates back to the turn of the first millennium. So, 300 BC to 300 CE, there was an older dynasty called the Cholas who became urban by trading with ancient Rome. That's how old they were. But in the centuries in between, the name Chola was used by many people. In Andhra Pradesh, we have people who call themselves Cholas, for example. And many men in the Kaveri area also, one family started calling themselves Cholas. Now, how do these guys begin to come to power is by playing off the Pallavas and the Pandyas against each other. They would do marriage alliances with families of similar status, and the queens of all of these families would build temples while the men went to war. So you have a very interesting situation where the women are the main face of the dynasty because they are building the stone temples. And keep in mind, we talked about how the temple is the community space. It is where all the records are being kept. So when a queen is building a temple, she's essentially acting as the ambassador of her family to this local population, and she's showing them that look, my family respect your gods, so please pay taxes to us. It is something like that.
Hmm.
Now, what really begins to change is that in the late 10th century, um, gradually there's a lot of political chaos that is happening in the Indian peninsula. So in the Deccan region, there was a very powerful empire called the Rashtrakuta Empire, जिसके बारे में मैंने मेरे पहले किताब में लिख लिया, Lords of the Deccan. Or the Rashtrakutas built the Kailashnath temple at Ellora. They were considered by the Arabs to be
Yeah.
one of the four great kings of the world, on par with the Caliph, with the Emperor of China. And in the year 972 CE, their capital was attacked and burned and sacked. And as a result of that, there's a huge political vacuum in South India. So, into this vacuum, the Cholas are able to expand. And under the conqueror king Rajaraja Chola, they very rapidly fill up the political vacuum. They conquer a huge chunk of the coast. Now, normally in the geopolitics of ancient India, हम देखते हैं कि the great empires are in the river valleys. So Mauryas, Guptas, Ganga Yamuna Valley, Rashtrakutas, Chalukyas, Marathas, even this is all in the Krishna Godavari Valley. You never see an empire that is based only in the coast. The Cholas are the first because of this exceptional geopolitical situation, and also because of the exceptional nature of Tamil society. Because merchants were so important, merchants had all these connections, they had all these logistical abilities. So it became possible for the Cholas to send armies further than they had ever gone before. And with the wealth that was brought back by these armies, they're able to build temples. Now, once again, it might seem that it is happening purely because of devotion. I think definitely devotion must have been a part of it. But more importantly, what we are seeing in temple construction is a very rudimentary media strategy.
Hmm.
Because while the earlier Chola kings and queens had only built one temple in their lifetime, suddenly Rajaraja Chola is able to build 50 temples. And on these 50 temples, he has the same message of how he's a great conqueror. And every year, as he's going out and making more conquests, he's coming back and writing them on the temples. So, if you were to go to one of Rajaraja Chola's temples, you'll see this ever expanding and growing list of conquests. You're obviously going to think that this man is favored by the gods. He is a great leader, he's a great general. And because of this consistent messaging that is happening in places where people are or where important and wealthy people are gathering frequently, you begin to see that the all these diverse players, all these village assemblies, all these Nadu assemblies start to think of the Chola as the legitimate ruler. So, and we know this happens when in business that's entirely local. It'll be stuff like, oh, we are going to repair the bund of this tank. They'll say, in year 5 of Emperor Raja, we the village assembly have decided to do this. And I think that is how you see the expansion of the Chola state today. When we think about ancient India, when we think about kings, हम ऐसे सोचते हैं कि अगर राजा ने कुछ ऑर्डर दिया था,
हुँ।
everybody is just falling down and being like, yes, yes, Maharaj, yes, whatever you say, Huzur, we will do this immediately.
हाँ।
This was not the case. Even today, states do not have absolute control over people.
हुँ।
Even today, it is important for states to secure the consent of the ruled. It is important for states to project the reason why people should voluntarily follow them. And this was the case even for states 1000 years ago, except their media obviously is a lot slower than our media. But the fact is that they did have media, they did have a concept of public relations, of securing the consent of the ruled. What they did with that consent is a different matter. Well, today we have welfare states. Our expectation is the state should educate us, the state should provide healthcare, the state should enable us to live a better life and for our children to live better than we did. This was not the case for medieval states. Medieval people expected that the king must be able to protect them. That is the primary duty of the king. And by showing his military prowess through disseminating it through temples, the Chola king is able to establish himself as the legitimate ruler, not just to the Nadu assemblies, but also to the merchant corporations. And we have talked a little earlier about how the Cholas built this alliance with the merchants. So, थोड़ा सा long answer, I know. Actually, बहुत long answer था, but I hope it answers the question.
हाँ,
नो
नहीं
ये
ये
बहुत अच्छा ओवरव्यू
हुँ,
मिल गया कि क्या-क्या था और कैसे ये बन के आए हैं। तो लेकिन ये इतना सारी जो गिफ्ट्स दे पा रहे थे लोग ये टेम्पल्स में, तो मतलब वहाँ की इकोनॉमी बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग रही होगी ऑब्वियसली अगर वो कावेरी के फ्लड प्लेन्स में ये डायनेस्टी बन के आ रही है तो दे वर प्रोबेबली ड्रॉइंग देयर वेल्थ वहाँ के एग्रीकल्चर से और शायद ये जो मर्चेंट और जो ट्रेड्स हो रहा था, ट्रेड के थ्रू भी वो they must be getting a lot of revenue, is it?
So today, if you look at the Kaveri River, most of the really wealthy farming areas are in the delta. Because the delta is where all the alluvial silt is deposited. But once again, 1000 years ago, this was not the case. Yes, all this rich silt is being deposited, but it will be much more like the Sundarbans than like the land of agrarian plenty that it is today.
Hmm.
It would have been a very wild and very dense swamp. But what the Cholas are able to do is because they are able to go on these wide ranging military expeditions, an enormous amount of liquid wealth is coming in. And this wealth is invested in expanding agriculture. It is invested in deforesting the swamps, in harnessing the power of the river, in regulating the flow of the river through bunds, through canals, through irrigation tanks. And if you look at the great Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore, it is one of the most fascinating examples of how medieval states operated. Because just as much as Rajaraja Chola talks about his military glory, just as much as he talks about his devotion to the god, he is also very careful saying that these gifts have to go to these parts of the kingdom. So I am sending these 10,000 sheep which I have conquered from various places. I'm going to dispatch them to the dry parts of the kingdom, and the shepherds have to provide ghee, which will be used in the temple rituals. Similarly, I have such and such amount of gold I'm giving to the temple. I'm sending it to these assemblies in this part of the kingdom, and they must expand the cultivation of the delta and pay back a 12.5% interest to the temple. So there's a very sophisticated understanding of economics. It's not the same as ours, of course. I don't think that they had they did not have a very detailed theory of economics the way that we do, but there is very clearly a sense of investment, risk, reward, and interest. And these are all things that we know that the merchants also had. The merchants, because now you have a new elite that has a lot of money, the merchants want to provide them with wealth. They already have connections in different parts of Southeast Asia, and they're able to secure We know that when Rajaraja Chola sent his embassy to China, the embassy gave as gifts to the Chinese emperor, I think about 1 ton of pearls total, but it also gave frankincense, about 200 kg of frankincense. Frankincense, once again, does not come from India, it comes from Arabia. They must have imported that from Oman. And it also gave these pearls. Also, if you think of where the pearls come from, they're not just they don't grow on the delta of the Kaveri. Pearls are found on the northern shore of Sri Lanka and the southern tip of India, both of which were rivals of the Cholas. So clearly, simply if you look at this one gift, you can see what are the sources of the Chola state's income. It is wide ranging trade, it is conquest, and also going back to what I was saying earlier, it is agriculture and this consistent ability, this consistent urge to keep investing in agriculture. So that is the financial basis of the kingdom.
अनिरुद्ध, लेकिन मर्चेंट्स तो जैसे पल्लवा है और पंड्या है, चेरास है, फिर कलिंगा किंगडम में भी वहाँ के भी कनेक्शंस है मर्चेंट्स साउथ ईस्ट एशिया में, तो ये सब लोग मर्चेंट्स को इस तरीके से क्यों हार्नेस नहीं कर पाए जैसा चोलास कर पाए?
I think that it's because of the structure of Tamil society that it was Ajkal we think of the caste system as this eternal unchanging thing. We think it's like a pyramid and each caste is fully distinct from each other. But that was not the nature of Tamil society. You have a lot of cases where we talked about the merchant being the ambassador. We have other cases where the merchant is also a warrior. We have cases where the merchant is also a courtier. So there's this very consistent blurring of the boundaries. One year a man might be out adventuring as a merchant, the next year he might be sitting and administering the Chola king's temple gifts. So it is because of this blurring of the boundaries that the Chola state is able to harness the Tamil merchants. And also keep in mind that I think it's if you were to look at the way that the monsoon blows, the if you catch the monsoon winds from the coast of Sri Lanka, within the course of 2 weeks, without fail, you will land up in the wealthiest part of Southeast Asia, which is the Malacca Strait. If you were to catch the monsoon from Odisha, it is much more likely to take you to Burma than to Malacca or Sumatra. So it is partially geography, it is
That's true.
partially the structure of society that leads to this that leads to this like somewhat unique happenstance. But also, if you were to look at the kings of any other part of India, generally speaking, their interest tends to be mostly inland because the main source of the revenue of the state is in agriculture. Because most of these, if you look at Odisha, for example, it has a vast Mahanadi delta to draw harvests from. But the Cholas, when they are emerging, the Kaveri is not so agricultural. It is still in the process of being claimed for agriculture. So for them, there is an importance that is associated both with the land, but also this consistent and long running linkage with what is happening overseas.
इंटरेस्टिंग। तो जैसे आगे बढ़ते हैं, और ये जो चोल राजमंडल है, आपने इसमें भी बताया है कि किस तरीके से चोलास जब झगड़ रहे हैं चेरास, पंड्यास और पल्लवा से, तो वो अपने खुद के राजा बना देते हैं वहाँ पे, चोला पांड्या, फिर चोला केरला, ऐसे
Yeah.
सब। तो उसके बारे में बताइए, क्या क्या माजरा है, कैसे ऑपरेट कर रहे थे वो इसमें?
So, generally speaking, in ancient India, when a king went and defeated an enemy, he would take his enemy off the throne, and then he would find some distant relative of the enemies and put him as the puppet, as the vassal who will give guaranteed tribute. Now, this was not possible for the Cholas because their ascent was so sudden, so rapid, and happened mostly because they took their neighbors all by surprise. The Chola king before Rajaraja is a man called Uttama Chola. The guy was fairly peaceable, as far as we know, did not do any major expeditions during his lifetime. But Rajaraja Chola, the year that he comes to the throne, he just goes and attacks the Chera fleet, which is at port in a place called Kandalur on the coast. So, when you begin your reign in such a way, you're not exactly encouraging relationships of trust and loyalty with all of your neighbors. the invasion of Sri Lanka also happens in a similarly a surprise attack, which takes the Sri Lankans completely by surprise. And keep in mind what I was saying about the Cholas have this need to be followed by very diverse people in Tamil Nadu. So that requires them to portray their enemies as just as these terrible blackguards who have been overwhelmed by the might of the Chola king. So in there's a district that Rajaraja Chola creates right next to Kerala called Keralantaka Valanadu, which means Kerala Destroyer Prosperity District. So this kind of thing is not going to make the Cheras like you at all. They are not going to want to obey you after you've done all these things. There is very little possibility for them to be your vassals and pay you regular tribute. So what happens is that in the 1020s, under Rajendra Chola, who is the successor of Rajaraja, they begin to realize that look, boss, with this endless conquest is not feasible. So let us try to make these kings our vassals. So the king of Sri Lanka is persuaded to surrender. He bows down, and Rajendra is like, okay, you're my vassal now. But then something happens which was completely unexpected that nobody thought would happen, which is that Rajaraja gets his hand on the Chera crown, which he finds in some fort in Kerala that his army suddenly take by a surprise attack. So now he has the Chera crown. He has the Lanka crown, which has been given to him by his vassal. And the interesting thing is that the previous generation, the Pandya king had fled to Lanka and he gave his crown to the Lankan king. So when the Lankan king came out to Rajendra's side, he also gave him the Pandya crown. So suddenly, Rajendra Chola has the crowns of all the important kingdoms of South India. And he says, look, I anyway can't trust these guys. There is no guarantee they aren't going to betray and backstab me. So I'm going to backstab them first. And I'm going to make my sons the princes. So he sets up one of his youngest sons, a man called Veera Chola. He says, okay, now you are the Chola Lord of Lanka. And he puts him in Sri Lanka. He takes his middle son and he says, okay, now you are the Chola Pandya. And he puts him in the Pandya territory. And similarly, he seems to have tried to do that with another son. He made him the Chola Kerala. Another son, he made him the Chola Ganga, which is in the area around present day Bangalore. But these fellows, either they were not, great personalities, or their father was too interested in these regions to ever like fully give them control. So essentially, the Chola Rajamandala that is created is the Chola king with his sons as sub kings in ruling as his in his name in a circle around him. So that's how he creates a circle of allies around him. But there's also a circle of enemies. That is the nature of the Rajamandala. So if you look at the east coast of India, you will see that the kings of Odisha become the enemies of the Cholas, and the kings of the Deccan, the emperors of Deccan. It's a huge region. They also have many reasons to distrust and be wary of the Cholas. So they also become enemies. So if you're to think of the if you think of India as this, the peninsula as this large ice cream cone, the bottom part of the cone is pro Chola. The middle part of the cone is anti Chola. So then the upper part of the cone must be pro Chola. That's what you'd expect to see. And very interestingly, this was actually the case. So the Parmar dynasty in present day Madhya Pradesh were allies of the Cholas. Now, neither of them say this explicitly, because both the Parmars and the Cholas want to claim that we are independent. No, those guys are just helping us. We are actually independent kings. We don't need anybody's alliance to help conquer. But they have mutual enemies, and most interestingly, they also share the same particular sect of Shaivism. So they are Shaiva Siddhantins, and the Shaiva Siddhanta was a very influential Shaivite school, and teachers following the Shaiva Siddhanta were active both in the Parmar court and in the Chola court. So there's a possibility that some ideas, whether they were diplomatic ideas or purely religious ideas, could also have been exchanged through this channel. And I think it's not a coincidence that very soon after Rajendra Chola builds his great Gangaikonda Cholapuram temple, the Parmars also try to build a huge imperial temple. So in Bhojpur, which is not far from Bhopal, I think it's a few hours drive, they start building a Shiva temple that would have been 1.5 times the height of the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore. It would have been the greatest temple ever built, but the Chalukyas, who are the mutual enemies of both the Cholas and the Parmars, attack it instead, and they sack the Parmar capital. So the greatest temple ever built ends up becoming the greatest temple never built.
हाँ, वो कोरमंगला फ्लाईओवर जैसा हो गया मामला। तो एक अनिरुद्ध, अब आपने 2 किताबें लिखी है इसमें। इसमें मुझे एक सवाल था कि इस टाइम पे आप हम लोग को एक भारत की कोई एक कॉमन कल्चरल आइडेंटिटी देखने को मिलती है कि आपको आपके इस शोध कार्य में? क्योंकि हमको ये तो पता है भारत एज अ राष्ट्र या नेशन तो बहुत बाद में हुआ, एंड एंटी कॉलोनियल स्ट्रगल वगैरह वगैरह, लेकिन अक्सर लोग कहते हैं कि एक सिविलाइजेशनल आइडेंटिटी थी। तो सिविलाइजेशनल आइडेंटिटी थी क्या? एटलीस्ट जो आपके सोर्सेज हैं इन दोनों किताबों में, इससे कुछ पता पड़ता है क्या हमको?
So there is definitely a shared political vocabulary. There is a shared religious vocabulary at the elite level. So it's very important to make that distinction. Yes, there is a stratum of society that can talk to each other in Sanskrit, that has a vast geographical sense that sometimes overlaps with, sometimes extends beyond, sometimes remains within the boundaries of present day India. That is definitely there. But to what extent was this felt at the ground level, I think is very much up for debate. We tend to take our modern ideas of how religions worked, how religious identity worked, how cultural identity worked, and we project them into the past. I think that for if you were to put the average Kannadiga 1000 years ago next to the average Tamilian from 1000 years ago, they would have looked, they would have dressed, they would have spoken and worshipped actually very, very different gods in very different ways. Their kings might have had a lot in common, but even then, when you look at Hoysala architecture, it has very little in common with Chola architecture. Yes, in principle, it is the same gods being depicted, but they're being depicted in completely different ways. So, what we are seeing, and I think that the just as the modern world has very contested identities, if you were to ask anybody on the street, who are you? They might tell you they're Bangaloreans, they might tell you they're Indians, they might tell you that they're Hindus, they might tell you they are Muslims, they might tell you they're Telugus, they're Kannadigas, they're Tamils. I think that surely this must have been the case for people in the past as well. Even today, when we have such a homogeneous media environment, when we have such strong national ideas that are imparted to us through our textbooks, even today, still we have so much diversity. So imagine what the case must have been when you had extremely diverse local climates, extremely diverse local cultures, where there was no single like dominant media idea of what any single concept should be. If you were to look at the travel accounts of anybody who was coming to India 1000 years ago, or even anybody who's coming to India 500 years ago, or even 200 years ago, the overwhelming impression that they are left with is diversity, diversity, diversity.
Hmm.
So I know it's not a simple answer. I don't think there can be a simple answer to such a question. Today, our impulse is to look for the common thread because, of course, we are the inheritors of this diversity. We want to see unity in diversity. So you can search for that and you can find it at a certain level of society. But if you want to find diversity and difference, then you can find that also. It is a complicated world, just like today's. I hope that
हाँ,
answers.
सही बात। हाँ, पर जैसा आपने कहा शायद एलीट लोगों की एक कॉमन भाषा थी, सब लोग एक पावर प्रोजेक्शन के लिए तो संस्कृत का प्रयोग कर ही रहे थे, इवन चोलास कर रहे थे, और तो वो था। लेकिन हाँ, जैसा कि आपने कहा रोजमर्रा के जीवन में शायद वो अप्लाई नहीं करता। इंटरेस्टिंग।
मुझे याद है एक जगह पे आपने लिखा है अपनी किताब में कि अगर कोई एक चोला राज्य से कोई इंसान जाके अगर वो श्रीलंका जाए या आज के जो आज के कर्नाटका कोई हिस्सा जो है वहाँ अगर वो जाए तो उसके लिए वो दोनों ही जगह इक्वली फॉरेन लैंड होंगी।
हाँ।
क्योंकि उस ज़माने में शायद एक जगह से दूसरी जगह जाना भी इतना आसान नहीं रहा होगा, तो वो सब लोग तो नहीं जाते हैं, तो जो कोई इक्के-दुक्के चले जाते हैं उनके लिए एक नई दुनिया खुल जाती है, ऐसा लगता होगा शायद।
Absolutely.
मतलब 1857 में भी हम लोगों ने जो एपिसोड किया था जब वो विष्णु भट्ट जाते हैं वहां पर विंध्यास के वहां पर ग्वालियर में, तो वो बोलते हैं मैं हिंदुस्तान जा रहा हूँ।
Yeah.
तो
वर्सोवा से जाते हैं जबकि वो तो
हाँ,
वर्सोवा से जाते तो बोलते हैं मैं वर्सोवा से हिंदुस्तान जा रहा हूँ, तो वो तो ठीक बात है। हिंदुस्तान तो काफी जिसको बोलते हैं कि गंगा जमुना वाला जो एरिया है उसके लिए शब्द यूज होता था हाल फिलहाल तक, right? तो यहाँ पे भी लेकिन हम बोल सकते हैं ना अनिरुद्ध, मतलब काफी लोग ऐसा कह भी सकते हैं और उसमें शायद कुछ लेजिटिमेसी भी है, राइट, कि जो एलीट लोग हैं वही तो दुनिया में उनकी पावर बहुत ज्यादा है, भले ही वो लोग कम हो। तो ये एक मुझे लगता है कि आप किस तरह से देख रहे हैं, अगर आप एक जिसको आजकल एक ट्रेंड भी है पीपल्स हिस्ट्री देखने का या फिर उस तरह से, तो हाँ वो एक बात है, लेकिन कुछ ही लोग बहुत ज्यादा पावरफुल भी तो थे पहले, जैसा कि आपने खुद ही बोला, मतलब अब राजा मंदिरों के गिफ्ट वगैरह में जब पावर वैक्यूम है तो लोगों में पावर बढ़ रही है, लेकिन जैसी पावर सेंट्रलाइज हुई तो एक तरह से लोगों की पावर कम भी हो रही है। तो वो इतने ज्यादा पावरफुल हैं कुछ लोग कि वो नैरेटिव भी डिसाइड करेंगे और वो ये भी डिसाइड करेंगे कि हम कौन हैं। वो हम डिसाइड करना भी एक पावर प्रोजेक्शन है ना।
Yes, absolutely. But to come back to this, but to give you an example, really, of this concept of Indianness, if you were to go to Europe also 1,000 years ago, and you were to ask somebody, "Are you European?" They would say, "What is European?" The concept of what is Europe, you can find that trend of that unifying trend. You can find Latin speaking Christians who have churches in different shapes but still recognizably churches all over Europe. You can find a similar clergy, even if there are all these differences at the local level. But it's not a very consolidated identity. This idea of what is India, what is Europe, these ideas begin to develop when these very large cultural units, which used to be mostly inward looking, from the 1500s onwards, they begin to connect with these very distinct regions. And it is in contact with these very different regions that the idea of what we are internally begins to take shape. That's how identity formation works. Identity formation is a process for which you need the other. You need somebody
हाँ,
else for you for to be
हम की
clear who.
परिभाषा के लिए तुम जानना बहुत जरूरी है, ये तो
Exactly,
नहीं होगा।
exactly. But coming back to the question, Saurabh, of like how yes, to a great extent, it is the voices, the powerful, that have survived from this time. So we have to remember that the voices of the powerful from 1,000 years ago were not meant for us. They were intended for audiences of 1,000 years ago. So, for example, today when we look at a Chola inscription, we are like, oh, we want to find proof that Rajendra Chola went to Southeast Asia, because that is what we are interested in. That is what we as Indians in the 21st century, we want to politically project this geopolitical strength into Southeast Asia. Therefore, we are looking for the words of Rajendra Chola that seem to speak most directly to us.
हाँ,
But 1,000 years ago, Rajendra Chola could not have imagined that there would have been a country called India that has these geopolitical aspirations, that had been colonized and therefore feels a need to be muscular. He could not have imagined that. That is completely beyond the realm of possibility for him. Or when he is saying that I went and attacked Kedah, his goal is to impress the potential recruits who would join up in his armies. His goal is to show that I am a pious king. His goal is to set up a particular temple. His audience is an audience that we can't imagine. So, when we are reading the voices of the powerful, it is important to remember that we are not the intended audience. They had somebody else only in mind. The interesting question is when you ask, who are these other people that you're speaking to? Right? And then you begin to get a sense of these medieval folks as human beings. They're very complex, very intelligent people, just like us. They are capable of telling lies. That's something we very often don't expect from the people of the past. But yes, they are capable of projecting, of spinning, of saying one thing, doing another. And this makes the Cholas so interesting to me, because you can get a sense of this. Now, when Rajendra Chola is giving one message in northern Tamil Nadu and a different message in southern Tamil Nadu, he's not thinking that somebody from the south will go to the north and cross check those facts. But we can. Sitting today, we can easily access both inscriptions and guess, oh, why is he saying this? What is the other evidence? We can guess at the truth of what is happening, and we can uncover this media strategy. So we are able to understand the voice of the powerful. We're able to actually peer more deeply into the societies that they are a part of. And to me, I think that is the most important part of studying history in a democracy. It is for us to understand how power operates. How did power operate then? How does power operate now? You'll see that very often it's quite similar in a lot of ways that you don't expect.
अनिरुद्ध, तो इसमें हम लोग एक आपकी बुक में एक जो बहुत बड़ी रेड है वो है गंगा के ऊपर, जो उन्होंने रेड की है गंगा डायनेस्टी में, तो वो और ऊपर तक जाते हैं। राजेंद्र चोला का फेमस है उनकी जो एक्सपीडिशन है नॉर्थ इंडिया में, तो उसके बारे में कुछ बताइए ना। उसके बारे में उन्होंने कैसे सोचा और क्या उसको लेकर के उन्होंने क्या बोला, किस तरह से वो इस चीज को देखते थे। ये इसी सवाल से जुड़ा हुआ है जो आप बता रहे थे।
So this is why I think that at the elite level there is certainly a degree of cultural understanding, because there is an idea that the Ganga is a sacred river, and the way that the medieval kings saw their world is that to be a king of kings, to be an emperor who can genuinely rule over other kings, then you need to be at the center of the world. To be at the center of the world, you have to control the celestial river, and you must control the celestial mountain. Now this is very easy in
सेलेस्टियल
North India.
माउंटेन हो गया, मेरू मेरू पर्वत और
Exactly.
हाँ।
So, for North Indian kings, it's very simple because the holy river is right there. So you can just say that, oh yes, I conquered the mountain also. Great, I am the king of kings. But for South Indian kings,
उस समय भी बोलते थे क्या कावेरी को दक्षिण गंगा? ये अभी नया चीज है।
this is where I'm getting at. Why do we call it Dakshin Ganga? When did that idea first originate? It's a Chola idea. So if you have to look at the Rashtrakuta Empire, who before the Cholas were the most powerful kings of kings, they also attacked the Ganga. They attack the Ganga near Kannauj. So they take a different route into North India, but they do go to North India. They take I'm willing to bet that they've brought some water as well. And but definitely what they did is they on their banners they would have Ganga and Yamuna, showing that they have conquered the North Indian rivers. And what they do is they build the Kailashanatha temple at Ellora, which is intended to be a representation of Kailasha. So the idea is that here is the world mountain, we have conquered the world river, therefore we are kings of kings. So when Rajaraja Chola builds his temple, the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore, he calls it Dakshina Meru, the southern Meru, which I think is
अच्छा,
very, very significant. But
ठीक।
Rajaraja Chola does not march north. He dies before he's able to do that. So I think that his son Rajendra, who is just what an imaginative guy. Like we talked earlier about his Kedah expedition, but here also like it before going to Kedah, he had a bigger problem, which is that he has set up all these say all his sons as Chola Pandya, Chola Lankeshwara, all that stuff, but he's still stuck in endless wars with the Deccan. So he decides that it's time for a symbolic display that I am genuinely the king of kings and you must not be challenging me. His father has built Dakshina Meru, but he has not consecrated it with Ganga water. So I think that it had not achieved the political purpose or the ritual purpose for which it was intended. So what does he decide to do? He decides to make a new world mountain, the Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the great temple. But in order for it to work properly, it has to also be consecrated with the waters from the world river. So he excavates a great tank called the Chola Ganga. And for the Ganga to be properly conquered in this tank, you have to go get the waters. Now, this is the justification that is given. Whether that is the sole justification is up for debate. Politicians will say one thing, but they will always do another. It may also be that Rajendra Chola saw that here's a political situation on the East Coast. These guys are not expecting that I can attack them. But what if I do? What if I'm able to take them by surprise and secure a valuable source of wealth for myself so I can build a temple? We don't know for sure, but what we can see is if you look at Rajendra Chola's inscriptions, there's a way to read the inscriptions. I think you should not take everything for granted that Rajendra Chola says. You have to look for what in this inscription can we verify. So when you look at the inscription where he talks about the Ganga expedition, he says, I captured King Indraratha of the Somavamshi dynasty at Adinagar, which is present day Jajpur. He would not be claiming this if he did not have Indraratha on display, so people could see that he had been conquered. But then he also claims I conquered this country, I conquered that country, I conquered this country, I conquered that country, but he doesn't provide any details about this. So I think these are just there formulaically. There is no way that anybody could have proven this, so he has just put them there. After that, he says, I defeated King Ranasura, I defeated King Mahipala, and these are kings in Bengal. So we have a very detailed, verifiable claim that was made about Jajpur in the southern part of Odisha, and then a whole bunch of nonsense in between, and then a verifiable claim that he defeated such and such kings in Bengal and captured their treasures and their elephants and their women, which was something the medieval kings did. This is also would have been a verifiable claim for somebody in the Chola court. But what does this tell us? We think that when Rajendra Chola sent his expedition to the Ganga, we think that the men must have walked that entire distance along the east coast. But if an army is marching that far, you have to feed it for much, much longer. You have to take thousands and thousands of tons of rice. You have to drag them all the way up the east coast. And it's very easy for their lines of communication to be cut. So, to solve that problem, if you were to simply use merchant ships to follow your troops to drop off rice at designated points, then you're able to extend the reach of your armies. But the logical next step, if you're using the ships to transport rice, is to use the ships to transport men. And
Yeah.
I think that's what happened, where up to Jajpur, he still marched, but then he figured that, look, it's just smarter to put the guys on ships and send them to Bengal. And the impression you get from the inscription is that the Bengalis had no idea he was coming. They were taken completely by surprise. So they must have expected, they would have heard that they're marching up the coast. They must have expected the Cholos will arrive over land. Imagine the shock and surprise when they arrive over sea. And suddenly you have Chola armies in the heart of Bengal. So I think that that is what happened. As much as the water of the Ganga, he also talks quite a lot about the jewelry and the wealth that was captured. So I think that was also a big part of it. And the fact that now this logistical system has been worked out. He's able to strike with a reach and a speed and a scale that no other enemy had any answer to. And once he had developed that idea in Bengal, it makes sense that he would apply that idea in Kedah as well. So once you just read the sources more carefully and you think about the practicality of how these things would have been achieved, then you begin to see the really amazing and innovative nature of the Chola state.
सही है.
तो इसमें
तो
मुझे
ये
लगता है कि
बेसिकली ये जो खासकर जो गंगा पे अटैक है, यू आर सेइंग कि ठीक है वो अटैक तो एक बात है, लेकिन अटैक की प्रेस्टीज वैल्यू जबरदस्त है. और उससे वो राजाधिराज, क्या उनको राजा राज जो की
Yes,
उपाधि है वो इसीलिए है, राजा राज की राजाओं के राजा हो गए
Raja.
क्योंकि वो साउथ से जाके गंगा ले आए. और आई थिंक प्रणय शुरू में इसीलिए आई थिंक वो सवाल भी इसी पे हिंटेड था कि गंगा को लाना इतना इंपॉर्टेंट है, तो फिर एक हिंदुस्तान की एक वो कल्चरल आइडेंटिटी है, भले ही एलीट में हो लेकिन लोगों के दिमाग में भी, आम मानुष के दिमाग में भी होगी. उन्हीं के ऊपर तो वो अपना प्रतिष्ठा बना रहे थे ना.
Well, depends. We don't know who were the people who were reading the inscriptions. Was it your
ठीक
average guy
ठीक
or was it the literate person? How literate
ऑफ
was the
कोर्स
society? We don't
ठीक
have the evidence to be completely sure. But see,
ठीक
there's the interesting concept of, to them, the concept of India, of whatever the heartland is, can be picked up and transplanted into their country. So to us, India is a fixed entity. There is one Ganga river, there is one Meru. For them, there could be many Gangas, many Merus. You could pick it up, you could pick up the model, put it anywhere. That's why you see, for example, the Mekong River also is technically the Ganga River in Southeast Asia. The idea has just been picked up and transplanted there.
हाँ.
So
मैंने कभी नहीं सोचा था इसको इस तरह से.
हाँ.
yeah,
नहीं,
but that's
जैसे
what it is.
अयुत्थाया है थाईलैंड में,
हाँ.
वो
Yes.
भी अयोध्या है ना.
हाँ.
तो
हाँ.
एक्चुअली ये डायना एल एक की जो किताब है इंडिया, उसमें भी यही मेंशन किया है कि किस तरीके से लोग एक मतलब एक सेम इंस्टेंसिएशन बनाना चाहते थे अलग अलग जगह पर, राइट?
Yeah, and it's like you see with Rome also, you see the same thing happening. There is the city where go second Rome, third Rome, fourth Rome, fifth Rome. There's all these places. So essentially, what is happening here? Yes, there is obviously there's a sense of cultural connection and transference, but the idea is that is no longer Rome. We are Rome.
Yeah.
So is it the same as a contemporary nation? I'm not entirely sure. Definitely, I'm not disagreeing that there was the very fact that this sense exists, I think, is telling, but it doesn't correspond perfectly to our boundaries.
ऑफ कोर्स नहीं मॉडर्न तो नहीं है. हम तो दूर में कुछ प्रतिबिंब ढूंढ रहे हैं. हमारे रिफ्लेक्शन ऑफ द टुडे, वो तो अब नेशनलिज्म तो एकदम मॉडर्न चीज है, तो
Yeah.
नेशनलिज्म तो उस समय नहीं है और हम ढूंढना भी नहीं चाहिए. हमें बहुत ही मॉडर्न विचार है. लेकिन ये है कि एक हिंदुस्तान की परिकल्पना इवन तमिलनाडु में है. ये एक अच्छी, मतलब ये ठोस वो है कि भाई गंगा गंगा और दक्षिण गंगा बनाना जो है, और ये कब हुआ ये भी इंटरेस्टिंग है ना। ये ऐसा नहीं है कि 2000 साल पहले हुआ, ये 1000 सवा हजार साल पहले हुआ, क्योंकि शायद कैपेबिलिटी भी थी करने की। इमेजिनेशन तो शायद लोगों में पहले भी होगी, लेकिन करने की क्षमता भी होनी चाहिए किसी
Yeah, and
किसी
there
बड़े
are
राजा
many
में।
people who had this, both within India and
हाँ
outside India. You had
बिल्कुल,
Burmese who had the
एम्बिशन तो
same
सब में
idea,
है। हाँ
Javanese who had the same idea, Cambodians who
हाँ
have the same idea. So it's a very, I don't know, it's fascinating. It's such a unique product of the medieval Indian Ocean world. It's fascinating.
तो इसमें जो मर्चेंट नेवीज हैं वो मतलब एक प्रकार के हीरो है इस जमाने के, क्योंकि उनके पास एक सुपर पावर है ना जो बाकी लोगों के पास नहीं है। और शायद वो क्या तो आप उनके कुछ नेविगेशन के बारे में जानते हैं हम उसके बारे में कि वो किस तरह से क्या वो सोफिस्टिकेटेड तरीके से नेविगेट करते थे, कि जैसे आपने कहा कि ट्रेड विंड्स, मॉनसून विंड्स जिस तरह से ब्लो हो रही है उससे वो हो रहा था, तो उस पर थोड़ा और बताएंगे।
So it's compared to the way we navigate, it's very simple, but it's very effective. So, and the reason we know this is that, so there was this professor called B. Arunachalam, who was a geography professor, I think, at the University of Mumbai. He was with the Maritime History Society. And during some field work in the Maldives, he found manuscripts written in Arabu Tamil, which is essentially Tamil but written in a script that is derived from Arabic. And these have lists and lists of various currents, various winds. They knew precisely which season, which time of year, in which part of the Indian Ocean, which direction the current should be going in. So you have to imagine that, and keep in mind this, until these were written down, for many generations, these were transmitted orally. So very often, when we ask about ancient Indian advances in knowledge, we are thinking only of the written materials, but there was a whole other oral world that we don't fully understand. And very often, the people who are developing this knowledge are developing it from practical experience, and by transmitting it down from father to son, uncle to nephew, over the course of many generations, they have this extraordinary corpus of knowledge. So, if you look at temple engineering, we are not entirely sure how literate were the architects. We have Vastu Shastras, we have Shilpa Shastras, but were these written by the architects or were these written by theoretical people sitting in the court who are then talking to the architects and coming up with this? We're not 100% sure. And something similar must have been happening with the navigational knowledge. It is all practical, but is kept by people who are not lettered, so we don't have a lot of evidence of it. But what we do have is very telling. They have measurements of the altitudes of stars. So, and such and such port can be found at such and such measurement of this star, that star. And interestingly, for them, the North Star was not our pole star; it wasn't Dhruva. For them, it was Betelgeuse. I think it was
Betelgeuse.
pronounced. That was their North Star because that was most visible 1,000 years ago from that part of the coast. And these were such accurate measurements that they were much more accurate than what Arab travelers had. We have travelers' accounts from the 12th, 13th century written by Arabs who say that Tamil navigators have the best star charts in the world. So it is a fairly intuitive matter if you know what is your star altitude, what is the star altitude of the place you want to go, which wind is going to point you in which direction, at what speed, at what point of year, then it's what is called great circle navigation. So to get to some place like Kedah, which is the port that the Rajendra Chola claims to have conquered, you have to navigate down from the Tamil coast. You have to go roughly to Trincomalee in Sri Lanka, which is roughly at the same latitude as Kedah. So once you've gone down to Trincomalee, if you know when the monsoon is going to arrive, you just put yourself in front of the winds and it'll blow you there very, very simply, very, very directly. Now, while you're at sea, you also have you have to keep correcting your course every night, of course. You will want to keep in touch with other ships, so you must have some kind of system of torches and drums that can be heard. You also have, we know that they had very simple ways of measuring time. So they would take a coconut shell, they would poke a hole in the coconut shell, and they would put that in a bucket of water. So it would take always the same amount of time for the shell to fill up with water. So using that, they can keep a regular sense of time. So they similarly, to measure the speed of the ship, now they have the time sorted out. To measure the speed, they would take a ball of ash, a moist ball of ash. They would throw it into the ocean, and they would measure how it disperses in the wake of the ship. So that allows them to get a sense of the speed of the ship. So it is not very advanced navigation. The sails of the ship, they don't have the lateen sail, the triangular one in the front that you very often see in European ships.
Hmm.
They very often, the ships just have one or two very large rectangular sails. They also aren't super stable, so you have an outrigger that is essentially like this long, small, slim mini ship that is connected to your main ship to help stabilize you in the water. So they're somewhat unwieldy, and they don't, very rarely do they have multiple decks. They have a single deck that is mostly open to the elements. In the middle of the deck, you have a small cabin where most people are going to be sleeping. And you don't have, it's not a Titanic experience. You don't have, the ship's crew is not coming and taking care of you, saying, "Sir, what do you like to eat?" You pay for passage, you get on the ship, you have to take care of your own cooking, your own cleaning, your own washing, even disposing of your own waste. So this was, while it was a very important part of the economy, it was not a very pleasant place to be in. A medieval,
Hmm.
very unpleasant place.
Hmm.
And we
सही
know
बात.
this partly from the Tamil sources. We know this also from the records of Jewish travelers, because there are a lot of Jews from Tunisia who had settled down on the coast of India in the 12th century, and their letters are incredibly detailed. We know that they were taking stuff like mangoes and rice back to Egypt after retirement. And we know, very interestingly, they'd also take wood with them as they were getting onto the ship, so that they could build cabins for themselves. They would sometimes build chairs and tables and all that on the ship. So this is very, very far from the luxury transport that we are accustomed to today.
वैसे अनिरुद्ध, क्योंकि आपको अर्थशास्त्र में भी दिलचस्पी है, आपने वो भी पढ़ाया हुआ है, तो हम लोग पिछले एपिसोड में बात कर रहे थे इंडिया स्ट्रेटेजिक थॉट वगैरह के बारे में, किस तरीके से हम लोगों की जो स्ट्रेटेजिक थॉट है पहले से भी वो सब कॉन्टिनेंट तक सीमित थी. अब लोगों ने हाल ही में कहा था कि चोलास थोड़ा काउंटर पॉइंट है उसका, कि उन्होंने एक्सपेडिशन वगैरह किया था. लेकिन आपकी किताब पढ़ने के बाद ऐसा लगता है कि एक्चुअली स्ट्रेटेजिक थॉट स्टिल वॉज लिमिटेड टू द सब कॉन्टिनेंट, क्योंकि ये जो एक्सपेडिशन है, एक तो एक ही एक्सपेडिशन है, और दूसरा ऐसा भी नहीं था कि वो कॉन्कर करने के लिए, और वहां पे ऑलरेडी सेटलमेंट्स थे, तो हम लोगों की कल्चरल इन्फ्लुएंस थी, लेकिन एक जियोपॉलिटिकल इन्फ्लुएंस बनाने की कोशिश शायद चोलास के साथ भी नहीं लगती है. तो आपको क्या लगता है, वर वी थिंकिंग ओनली ऑफ द सब कॉन्टिनेंट फ्रॉम अ जियोपॉलिटिकल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू?
So it depends on who you ask and which part of the subcontinent they are in. Because if you ask the Kashmiris are not restricting their understanding to the Gangetic Plains. So then the Gangetic Plains are some distant place. Their main enemies are the Central Asians. So they want to go fight with the Tibetans. They want to go fight with the people, the Tokharians up in the north. So, and if you were to ask, like, if you were to ask an Ahom king, the Ahom king is very interested in what's happening in Manipur. The Manipuris were very interested in what's happening in Burma. So obviously, if you look at the mainland part of India, the people who are living on the mainland are thinking about what is happening on the mainland. But the people who are living on the frontiers, they very clearly have a sense of what is happening outside what we would recognize as the boundaries. And especially if you look at the kings of Manipur, there's this chap called Pamheba, who later on takes the name of Garib Nawaz. This is in the 18th century, if I have the dates right. And Garib Nawaz's great conquests are all in Burma. And so you have to imagine that if the partition of Burma from the British Raj had not happened, if we had Burmese Indians today, they would be talking about how, oh, geopolitical imagination is limited only to Burma. But then if you were to look at the boundaries of Burma, you will find kings who are looking at Thailand. So it's to an extent, it's an accident of history. I think that if you were to draw a line on Earth, armies would have gone across it. People who are, it is the where the frontiers are is very much an accident of the politics of the 20th century. I i i hope that answers the question, Pranay, because like I said, it really depends on who you're asking where. Because the Chola imagination, I mean, it's limited to who is next to them. But the Kashmiri imagination is limited by who's next to them. Most medieval
हाँ.
people think about who's next to them, right? Why would
हाँ,
they?
पर ये था ना कि वहाँ जैसे नॉर्थ में तो आप देख सकते हैं कि क्योंकि हिमालयास था, तो हिमालयास को क्रॉस करना मुश्किल होगा, तो एक ज्योग्राफी का भी लिमिटेशन आया होगा ना, तो
To an extent, but again, the if you look at the Bengali Buddhist masters, they all want to go to Tibet. They are very happy to go to Tibet. The Atisha Dipankara, who is one of the most famous Tibetan Buddhist masters, originally Bengali. He studied, I think, at the University of Vikramashila, if I remember correctly. So to finish his studies, guess where Atisha Dipankara goes? Where does he get his PhD qualification?
I'm
Any guess?
guessing Tibet
Tibet,
because you
China, Tibet.
Sumatra.
Hmm.
He goes to Sumatra
Sumatra.
to get his final attestation as a
Hmm.
master. Then where does he go? He goes to Tibet.
Hmm.
So his limitation is clearly not limited by geography. If you look at Vajrabodhi, who is a Pallava prince, as best we understand, where does he have his most thriving career? In China. We actually know of quite a lot of Indian monks who had like long careers in China. Some for religiously pure purposes, but some of them were just straight up snake oil salesmen. There was one guy who, like, I think accidentally poisoned a Chinese emperor to death by giving him mercury potions.
Oh.
So
Hmm.
so it depends on who. See, the political power is going to be interested in where it can project power into realistically, right? Somebody who's sitting on the Indian mainland is going to think about the mainland because that's where he can send power. But a merchant is not restrained by the idea of the subcontinent. The merchant can go anywhere. The monk is not restrained by the idea of
Hmm.
subcontinent. The monk can go anywhere. So obviously, we have to keep in mind that when we say we, who do we mean?
Hmm.
It's not always just kings. There were many different kinds of Indians who had many different reasons for traveling overseas. One of the most fascinating archaeological traces we found of Indians is actually of a Tamil chieftain. I think his name was Koran, and he lived in the first or second century AD. We know he existed because his name is written on a wine amphora, of which fragments were found in Berenike, which is a Red Sea port in Egypt. So
Hmm.
if his name was written there, then clearly he was importing wine from there, right? So here he is outside, very much outside the subcontinent, on an entirely different continent, and he's there because he wants to get his hands on alcohol. Now, whether he had political aspirations to conquer Egypt is difficult to say, but when you simply expand our idea of how Indians thought, when you expand it beyond purely the purely geopolitical, then you begin to see that yes, there is no conception that we should be only here. They are happy to go and
हाँ
settle on everywhere.
नहीं वो तो कल्चरली तो पता ही है हमें कि मतलब इट इज यू कैन सी द इन्फ्लुएंस इन सो मेनी प्लेसेस पर हाँ क्योंकि ये डिबेट स्ट्रेटेजिक थॉट में आता है ना जैसे जॉर्ज टैनहम का ऐसे है या फिर और
This
तो
is like,
उस दृष्टिकोण से हम लोग बात
I'll tell
करते
you what I think of this. It's like asking, why did a English king not have an idea of projecting power into Greece? Why would he care,
हैं
boss? Like, this
हम्म
is a very, I found a very anachronistic concept, you know. Like, of
हम्म
course, yes, now we want, because India exists as a unit now, we want to understand where the strategic mindset was. But why would they think about projecting power
हाँ
thousands of miles away? How is it
हाँ और
strategically
उसका
thought?
एक एग्जाम्पल भी आपने दिया कि किस तरीके से चोलास और पंड्या किंग्स श्रीलंका को कॉन्कर हमेशा करना चाहते थे एक तरीके
हाँ,
से क्योंकि वो एक नजदीक था और वहां पर भी काफी एडवांसमेंट्स हो रही थी तो
yes.
वहां पे श्रीलंका को एक पार्ट की तरह देखा जाता है उस इकोसिस्टम का
Yeah, and like similarly, if you look at Shah Jahan, for example, Shah Jahan sends multiple expeditions to conquer Kabul. Is Kabul a part of the subcontinent or not? Like, to him, it's part of his kingdom. That's what he
हाँ
thinks. But today, one could reasonably make the case that it is not exactly a part of the subcontinent. And similarly, if you look at, it depends on who and where the boundaries of their kingdom were. If you were to look at some of the early Delhi sultans, or like actually before the Delhi sultan, if you look at Muhammad Ghori, for example, this guy's main obsession is with what's happening in Iran. This is the same for the Ghaznavid kings also. For Mahmud of Ghazni, he's very interested in what's happening in Iran. So it's largely a result of like what is the particular geopolitical circumstance. So, uh,
या
Pranit,
बिल्कुल हाँ
this is a dangerous question to ask a historian because I will just come up with all
हाँ
yes, in this
ये
case, here's the
वो
ये
वो वो मेरे को पता पड़ गया पूछने के बाद पता पड़ गया तो अनिरुद्ध अब आगे बढ़ते हैं चोलास के ऊपर अब मैं ये पूछना चाहता था कुछ गलतफहमियां बहुत है क्योंकि जैसा आप कह रहे थे कि आज की पॉलिटिक्स के दृष्टिकोण से हम लोग चोलास को देखना चाहते हैं। तो कुछ गलतफहमियां जो इस किताब में मिली, तो आप उसको बताइए उसके बारे में। एक तो जैसे गलतफहमी है, नहीं गलतफहमी है कि नहीं पता नहीं, लेकिन लोग कहते हैं कि भारत जो चोलास के अंडर विश्व का 40% जीडीपी भारत में था, एक ये धारणा है। एक तो आपने बता ही दिया एक्सपेडिशन का, नेवी के बारे में कोई एविडेंस नहीं है लेकिन मर्चेंट्स के थ्रू है, तो एक वो दूसरा हो गया। तीसरा एक और मुझे लगा, जैसे आज के काल में लोग कहना चाहते कि एक द्रविडियन आइडेंटिटी थी और एक नॉन द्रविडियन आइडेंटिटी थी, लेकिन इसमें भी देखते हैं हम लोग संस्कृत का प्रयोग भी हो रहा था एटलीस्ट एलिट लेवल पे। तो ये ऐसी कौन सी गलतफहमियां थी जो आपने एनकाउंटर की और आपको फिर वो अनरावल करने में मजा आया?
Well, the Sanskrit one is a great example. Like some of the
हम्म,
most remarkable texts of the Shaiva Siddhanta
हम्म,
in Sanskrit were written in Tamil Nadu. So, for example, there is this text called the Mahotsava Vidhi, which is the the way of the great procession. This was written in a Tamil cultural context because the procession of the god outside of the temple is very much a Tamil idea that then goes into the rest of India. But it is written in Sanskrit and it is written by, I think, a Kashmiri who has come and settled down in Tamil Nadu.
हम्म,
And we have an example of we know in the late 12th century that the Sri Lankans, having expelled the Cholas from the island, they set up their own powerful kingdom and then they cross the shore and they attack the Shiva temple at Rameshwaram, which is the southern tip of India today. And somehow some military warlord up near Kanchipuram hears about this, and he goes and finds a priest to perform a powerful ritual. The priest's name was Umapati Ganguly. So this guy had come down from Bengal, settled down there, and he was considered to be a master by this local Tamil-speaking chief. And of course, the ritual would have been conducted in Sanskrit. Um, Similarly, if you look at the Chola copper plates, which were the records used to give land grants to Brahmins. This is also an idea. The idea is that the Cholas did not believe in caste, etc., etc. There's a very strong strain of Tamil nationalism which genuinely believes this, but the historical evidence complicates it. Yes, the caste system was not as ingrained as it later became, definitely, but it was there. There was a
हम्म,
clear idea of the ritual purity of Brahmins being important for temple ritual. And specifically, Rajendra Chola even talks about inviting North Indian Brahmins to participate in his Gangaikonda Cholapuram temple. And the copper plates that mention the land grants to Brahmins always have a long opening section called the Prashasti, which is written in Sanskrit. Now, all the details of which lands, where, what is the boundary of this plot, that plot, that's all written in Tamil because you had the local administrators had to read that. But the Sanskrit portion is meant to be read by the Brahmins, not just the local Brahmins, but also you can imagine there must have been copies made of it that were disseminated to other Brahmins in other parts of India. So definitely, it's kind of like today, like we are speaking English here, we will speak English in international fora, but at home I will speak Telugu, at home you will speak Hindi. That's how it is. Depending on the context, we can be either English or we can be Indian. It's the identities are not as clear. So I think this is the case for medieval India as well. Now this other question about the 40% GDP, I genuinely don't know what the source is for this. We don't. I want to know what the where the data for this is coming from, because we have a ridiculous amount of questions from 1,000 years ago. We don't even understand the changes of the price of commodities. We have some glimpses of what the price of rice was in one part of the Kaveri floodplain, but if you ask me, you tell me, okay, so in the next year, what was the price in the same region? I can't tell you because we don't have the data. Now, when that is the situation on the ground, if there is so little actual data surviving, we don't even have population estimates, we don't have the population of the most important Chola cities. How do we know what the share of the world GDP is? I don't think we have the data for that, but I have a theory as to why people think that is the case. There is a much better established, factually grounded, and attested metric that in the 1700s, India controlled 30% of the world GDP. But as it happens, the Mughals were also around in India at the time. Now, I am not. We have to admit that the Mughals were a pre-modern polity. They also had oppressive taxation systems. You have many cases where the peasants were rebelling against them, but you also can't deny that at the same time there was a great concentration of capital. Consumption was at a great high, and you had
Hmm.
a very considerable system of textile export that led to a huge chunk of world wealth coming into India. That these are both true.
Hmm.
But politically, it is not convenient to accept that under the Mughals that India had a large chunk of the world GDP. Therefore, some
उसके पीछे
yes,
जाएगा.
so you have to go beyond to a
हाँ.
good Shaivite dynasty that,
हाँ.
and you have to say that they had an even bigger chunk of the world GDP. But that's where I think that's where it comes from.
Hmm.
If there are if anybody who claims that India had 40% of the world GDP can tell me what the exact population and per capita income of Kanchipuram was in the year 1015, I will happily bow down to them and accept the statistic. That's
Hmm.
all I will say.
हाँ, सही बात. बहुत सही.
ठीक नहीं अनुरोध, हम तो तुमसे कहानियां सुनते रह सकते हैं और हमें पता है आपके पास बहुत कहानियां हैं, आपके काफी फैन हैं एकोज ऑफ इंडिया, योद्धा पॉडकास्ट सुनने वाले वगैरह. तो जिन लोगों ने नहीं सुने सुने, एकदम चिरकालीन पॉडकास्ट अनिरुद्ध ने बनाए हैं और ये किताब एकदम जबरदस्त लिखी है. ऐसी और कहानियां आप किताब में ढूंढिए. ये तो जिसको कहते हैं मुखड़ा था, तो आपने नजराना देख लिया इनकी कहानियों का, तो अंदर और बहुत माल है इस बुक के. तो बिल्कुल इसका आनंद लीजिए. और थैंक यू सो मच अनिरुद्ध, आज हमको इतनी जबरदस्त कहानियां और किस्से सुनाने के लिए.
Thank you, Saurabh ji. Thank you, Pranay ji. Thank you, Khyati ji. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening so patiently to all these stories. And I'll see you in future episodes of Pulyabazi.
बिल्कुल.
बिल्कुल.
बिल्कुल. हाँ, और मुझे बहुत ही मतलब क्योंकि हम लोग चोलास काफ़ी हिंदी ऑडियंसेस को और कम पता होगा, तो ये एपिसोड तो करना ही करना था. तो आप और भी हम लोग अनिरुद्ध के पास ऐसी कहानियां हैं, तो हम लोग फिर से अनिरुद्ध को बुलाएंगे. तो आप भी लोग पढ़िए इस किताब को और बताइए आपको कैसे लगी. शुक्रिया.
Thank you.
शुक्रिया.
शुक्रिया.